Greg came into my life when I was 10. My dad had passed away a year before, and my mom was doing her best to keep everything together. She was lonely, vulnerable, and I think she was just looking for someone to share the load. That's when Greg showed up. At first, he seemed like a great guy, helpful, charming, ready to step in as a father figure, but that didn't last. Over time, Greg's behavior started to change. He began controlling every aspect of our lives. Little things at first, like what we should eat for dinner or where we should go on weekends. Then it became more about who we could see, who we couldn't talk to, what my mom could spend money on. He'd criticize her for the smallest things, how she dressed, how she cooked. It chipped away at her confidence bit by bit. I watched her become more withdrawn, more uncertain. The laughter in our home disappeared. She fell into a deep depression, and I was just a kid, not sure how to help. One day, Greg just left. No warning, no explanation, just gone. My mom and I were left to pick up the pieces. I hadn't seen or heard from him since. Until last week. Out of nowhere, I get this message from him. The name pops up on my phone screen, and for a second, I think it must be some kind of mistake. But there it is, Greg's name. The message was simple. I've been thinking about the past and want to reconnect. I've changed. He mentions he's aware of my career progress, saying something about how proud he is of my success. Apparently, he's been keeping tabs on me. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. But a few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I thought maybe meeting him would bring some closure. Or at the very least, make sure he stays out of my life for good. So I agreed to meet. We met at a coffee shop in town. I got there early, found a table in the corner, and waited. When Greg walked in, he acted like nothing bad had ever happened. He smiled like we were old friends, making small talk, asking about my work, my life. I told him about my job as a software developer at a startup that had just gotten its big break. I explained how I'd been working late nights, weekends, doing everything I could to help the company grow, and how it was finally paying off. Greg listened, nodding, but there was something off about his reaction. He seemed too eager, too familiar. He started talking about how he's been doing some soul searching and wanted to make things right. He asked if I remembered the old days and laughed like they were some fond memory we both shared. I didn't respond. I just let him talk. Then he started hinting at needing my help. He didn't say exactly what he needed, just that he was hoping we could support each other now that we were back in touch. I didn't like the sound of that. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach, but I kept listening. It didn't take long before the criticism started. He asked why I was working at a startup, of all places, suggesting I should consider something more stable. He mentioned how living in the city seemed like a waste of money when I could buy a house in the suburbs and settle down. He even brought up my girlfriend, wondering if she was the one, or if I was just wasting my time. I could feel my patience wearing thin. He spoke like he still had some kind of authority over me, as if I needed his advice or approval. I stayed quiet, watching him, trying to understand what his game was this time. It was clear he hadn't really changed. He was the same Greg, just with a different approach. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice like he was about to share some great secret. He said something about keeping the family close. He said it with a smile, but there was an edge to his words. It wasn't a suggestion. It felt like a warning. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew enough to be on guard. After that, the conversation wrapped up quickly. He finished his coffee, stood up, and gave me a pat on the back like we were old pals catching up. He promised we'd talk soon and left without another word. I watched him walk out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the crowd outside. I sat there for a while, trying to piece together what had just happened. The way he acted, the things he said, it didn't add up. I had a feeling this was just the beginning of something, but I wasn't sure what. The only thing I knew for certain was that Greg wasn't done with me, and whatever he had planned, it wasn't going to be good. That vague comment about keeping the family close kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. I realized I needed to be prepared, whatever that meant, because when it came to Greg, nothing was ever simple or straightforward. And I knew better than to take his words at face value. Update 1. A week after the coffee shop meeting, Greg started making his presence known in my life in ways I didn't expect. It began with an unannounced visit to my workplace. I was at my desk, going over some code when I saw him through the glass doors. He was talking to the receptionist, pointing towards my office. I could see her face shift from polite to uncomfortable as he insisted on being let through. Moments later, he was standing in front of my desk with a wide grin. He greeted me loudly, calling me his stepson like we were part of some happy family. My coworkers turned to look, some curious, some confused. Greg didn't waste a moment. He walked around, introducing himself to everyone, acting like he had every right to be there. He made small talk, but his words had an edge. He mentioned how he always admired my dedication but wondered if maybe I was taking on too much. He spoke about how it must be hard for me to handle the pressure of the job. I noticed a few of my coworkers exchanging glances, and I knew exactly what he was doing, planting doubts, casting shadows. I tried to get him to leave, but he brushed it off, saying he was just trying to be supportive. After about 15 minutes of awkward conversation and sidelong looks from my boss, he finally left, but not without making sure everyone knew he was always there for me. I thought that might be the end of it, but I was wrong. A few days later, I heard from my girlfriend Lisa. She had run into Greg at a local cafe, or so he made it seem. He approached her, acting surprised to see her, and then started talking. He made comments about my commitment issues, telling her stories from when I was a teenager, how I'd always had a hard time sticking with things. She didn't buy into it, but it planted a seed of doubt, enough to make her ask questions when she got home. That wasn't the only incident. I found out Greg had reached out to some of my old friends, people I hadn't talked to in years. He acted like he was catching up, but it always ended with some remark about how I was distant or too focused on my career. A few friends reached out, asking if everything was okay, mentioning how Greg seemed worried about me. I didn't know how to explain that this was just his way of getting under my skin, making me feel like he was everywhere, involved in every part of my life. Greg also began making these so-called helpful suggestions. He suggested I move closer to him, saying it would be better for family bonding. He kept pushing the idea that my job wasn't stable enough, suggesting I look for something more secure, like a corporate position that he had connections for. Every time I turned down his suggestions, he'd get this look on his face, like he was hurt, disappointed. He never said it outright, but the message was clear. I was being ungrateful for his concern. Then came the phone calls to family members. I started hearing from aunts, uncles, even my mom's old friends. They told me Greg had reached out, talking about how he was trying to rebuild the family, make amends, but I was resisting. They didn't know the whole story, of course. Greg spun his narrative so well, playing the victim who just wanted to make things right. They urged me to give him a chance, to move past the past, not knowing that Greg was the one who had caused all the hurt in the first place. The worst was when my uncle, who I was close to, started acting distant. I reached out to him, and he hesitated before admitting that Greg had been in contact, saying that I'd been distant and unappreciative, that I was ignoring his attempts to make peace. My uncle seemed conflicted, unsure of what to believe. That's when I realized Greg was working to turn people against me, one by one. The final straw came when I noticed some strange activity on my bank account. A few small charges appeared that I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was some minor fraud, but then I realized they were for things Greg would know about. Small, specific purchases tied to old habits and routines I had years ago when he was still around. It hit me that he might have access to my information somehow. I changed my passwords, called the bank, and started checking everything twice. Not long after, I received an email from Greg. He mentioned things he couldn't possibly have known unless he had access to something private. Details about my finances, things I had only discussed with my closest friends. The email was friendly on the surface, but it was clear what he was doing, showing me he had information, that he was watching. That's when it all clicked. Greg wasn't just trying to reconnect. He was inserting himself into every corner of my life, trying to control it, manipulate it. He was using every trick he could to destabilize me, to make me doubt myself, to make others doubt me too. I realized that this wasn't just a phase or a one-time encounter. This was only the beginning of something more serious, more invasive. I knew I had to find a way to get ahead of this, to stop him before things got worse. But I also knew Greg wasn't going to make it easy. This was a game to him, and he was playing for control, just like he always had. And now, he had found new ways to keep his hold. Update 2. Things escalated quickly after Greg began showing up unannounced. A week later, I noticed my boss, Jeff, acting differently toward me. He'd always been supportive, appreciating the late nights I put in and the extra effort I gave. But now, there was a tension in his voice whenever we spoke. During a team meeting, he brought up some recent mistakes that seemed minor, almost irrelevant. I couldn't figure out why he was making such a big deal out of them. Later that day, I learned why. Jeff pulled me aside, explaining he had received a call from Greg. At first, Jeff thought it was just a friendly check-in, a concerned stepfather wanting to know how his son was doing. But Greg had started to drop hints, suggesting that I might be overwhelmed, that I might not be handling the responsibilities of my role very well. He mentioned he'd noticed me looking tired, seemed worried about my health and well-being. Jeff said it was just a courtesy call, but I could tell it had planted a seed of doubt. Within days, I noticed subtle changes at work. Some of the bigger projects I'd been leading were reassigned to other team members. I was left with smaller tasks, ones that didn't require much thought or creativity. My input wasn't being asked for in meetings like it used to be. I overheard a few coworkers whispering about how Jeff seemed to be keeping a closer eye on me. It didn't take long to figure out that Greg's interference was taking a toll on my professional life. Meanwhile, things with Lisa, my girlfriend, were getting worse. Greg had somehow gotten more personal information, details about past relationships and mistakes I'd made that I hadn't shared with anyone, not even her. He started showing up at places where Lisa and I would hang out. Once at a restaurant, he casually brought up a relationship I had in college, mentioning it in a way that made it sound like I was hiding something from Lisa. She looked at me with questions in her eyes, and I realized he was feeding her doubts, trying to make her think I wasn't being honest with her. That was just the beginning. Greg found more ways to get between us. He hinted at things about my past, small incidents that I'd nearly forgotten, but when twisted, could easily sound worse than they were. Lisa became more withdrawn, asking me questions late at night, things like why I hadn't told her about this or that. Our arguments grew more frequent, and I could see the trust between us starting to crack. Every time I thought we'd move past something, Greg found a new way to stir the pot, to remind her of the things I hadn't said, of the secrets I supposedly kept. Greg didn't stop there. He worked on isolating me further from people I trusted. He called up mutual acquaintances, people who knew both of us, and told them I was acting erratically, that I was stressed out, maybe even having a breakdown. He painted himself as the caring stepfather, just trying to help his stepson through a rough patch. People started avoiding me, unsure what to believe. Some of them wouldn't return my calls or texts. I'd show up to events, and there'd be an awkwardness in the air, as if everyone was waiting for me to confirm or deny what Greg had been saying. I decided I needed to confront him directly. I found him at a cafe he frequented and walked up to his table. I demanded he stay out of my life, that he stop interfering with my job, my relationship, everything. Greg just sat there, calm as ever, like he'd been expecting this. He didn't argue or deny anything. Instead, he smiled and leaned back in his chair. He talked about how family ties are hard to break and how he was just trying to reconnect, to help me in any way he could. He said I couldn't just shut him out, not after everything we'd been through. Greg's tone shifted slightly then, just enough to make me uneasy. He hinted that if I didn't want his help, he could always make things more complicated. His words were vague, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't going anywhere, and he wasn't going to make it easy for me to cut him off. I left the cafe knowing he'd only ramp things up from here, and I was right. 2 days later, I got called into Jeff's office again. This time, it wasn't a friendly chat. Jeff handed me a formal notice stating that my performance was being reviewed due to concerns that had been raised about my recent work. I knew immediately that these concerns were the result of Greg's interference. Jeff said he wasn't sure what was going on, but there were too many coincidences, too many small mistakes being brought to his attention. He was putting me on notice, saying I needed to step up or risk being let go. As I left Jeff's office, I realized the extent of Greg's reach. He had managed to turn my workplace into a hostile environment, my colleagues into skeptics, and my boss into someone who doubted my abilities. He was undermining my relationship with Lisa, casting shadows over our future, and now, my job was on the line. I knew this was only going to get worse unless I found a way to stop him, but I also knew Greg wasn't going to make it easy. He was playing a long game, one he was determined to win, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make me crumble. Update 3. Things at work got worse fast. The performance review Jeff had mentioned turned into something more serious. I tried to explain the situation, how Greg was interfering, but Jeff just looked at me like I was making excuses. He wanted proof, something concrete, but Greg was too careful for that. All Jeff saw were small mistakes adding up, deadlines missed by a few hours, minor details overlooked. Each time, it seemed to confirm the doubts Greg had planted in his mind. The more I tried to defend myself, the more suspicious Jeff became. A few weeks later, I was called into another meeting, this time with the higher-ups. They were polite but firm. My role was being reassigned. I was being moved to a less critical position, something they framed as a chance for me to regain focus. I knew what it really was, a demotion. Greg's meddling had worked. He had successfully damaged my reputation at work, and there wasn't much I could do to fight it. Around the same time, things with my family started to shift. I noticed my aunt and uncle were more distant, shorter on the phone. My cousins, who I'd been close to, seemed to be avoiding me at family gatherings. One night, my uncle finally came out with it. Greg had been in touch, again saying he was worried about me, that I was pushing everyone away, being difficult for no reason. He made it sound like he was trying to mend fences, but I was the one refusing to cooperate. My uncle urged me to just talk to Greg to try and work things out. He said family was too important to let old grudges tear us apart. I could hear the frustration in his voice, like he'd been dealing with this for too long and was tired of the drama. He didn't know the full story, didn't understand what Greg was really doing, and I couldn't explain it in a way that didn't make me sound paranoid or defensive. Friends were the same. People who I thought knew me well were now acting cautious, like they didn't want to get caught in the middle of something messy. I got fewer invites to hang out, fewer calls and texts. It was clear Greg had been talking to them too, feeding them his version of events. A few brave ones asked outright if something was going on between me and my stepdad. I tried to explain, but it always came out sounding complicated, like I was overreacting. The more I tried to clarify, the more it seemed like I was confirming Greg's story. But the worst was yet to come. Lisa had been patient through all of this, but I could see the strain. Every time Greg got to her, it left a mark. She started pulling away, questioning things I had never thought would be questioned. Greg had somehow gotten into her head, using every little piece of information he had gathered to make her doubt me. He talked about my past, my supposed issues, even my future, making it sound like I was hiding things from her, that I wasn't ready to commit. One night, after another argument sparked by something Greg had said, Lisa decided she'd had enough. She told me she couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore, that she needed space. She packed a bag and left, tears in her eyes but no hesitation in her steps. I watched her walk out the door, and it hit me just how much Greg had taken from me already. As if on cue, I got a message from Greg later that night, asking if I was okay and if there was anything he could do to help. I didn't bother replying. With Lisa gone, and my family and friends distancing themselves, Greg moved in for what seemed like his final move. He started suggesting we combine resources, saying it would help us both financially. He offered to help manage my finances, saying he had experience with investments and could ensure I didn't make any poor choices. It was clear he wanted control of my money, my assets, my entire life. I refused outright, but he wasn't deterred. He acted like I was making a big mistake, missing out on an opportunity. When I didn't budge, he became more aggressive, mentioning debts I had, hinting at ways he could help clear them up. I didn't know how he knew about the debts. I hadn't shared that with anyone. That's when I realized he had probably snooped around, maybe even hacked into my accounts. It was like he was everywhere, always a step ahead, always ready to strike. Then came the legal papers. I found them in my mailbox one morning, a thick envelope with a law firm's logo on it. Inside were documents stating that Greg had somehow gained partial control over a property my mom had left me. The property wasn't worth much, but it was mine, a piece of my past, something Greg had no right to. But there it was, his name listed as a partial trustee, with rights to make decisions regarding its use and sale. It didn't make sense. I hadn't signed anything, hadn't agreed to any changes. But somehow, Greg had found a way to manipulate the situation, to insert himself into something that wasn't his. The papers were clear, he had rights now, rights I didn't remember giving him. I stared at the documents, realizing just how far he'd gone, how much he'd managed to take from me in such a short time. He wasn't just playing games anymore. He was taking over step by step, piece by piece. And now, with this new development, it was clear he wasn't stopping anytime soon. Update 4. The legal papers were just the beginning. I knew I needed to fight back, so I found a lawyer to help me sort through the mess Greg had created. But Greg was clever. He knew how to use the system to his advantage. He had managed to get his name on the property through a loophole, something buried deep in the paperwork from years ago, something I'd missed completely. My lawyer explained that getting Greg's name off the documents wouldn't be easy. It would require time, money, and a lengthy court battle. Greg knew this and he was ready. Every time my lawyer tried to make progress, Greg's lawyer countered with another technicality or delay. The process dragged on, each step forward followed by 2 steps back. While the legal fight continued, my life fell apart around me. My family, still believing Greg's lies, sided with him. They thought I was being unreasonable, that I was holding on to old grudges instead of giving him a chance to make things right. They stopped returning my calls, stopped inviting me to family gatherings. Even my closest relatives seemed distant, unsure of who to believe. My friends weren't much better. Most of them had grown tired of the drama, tired of the constant back and forth between Greg's version of events and mine. Some of them outright told me they couldn't be involved anymore. Others just slowly faded away, leaving me to deal with the mess on my own. Work was no better. I tried to focus, to prove I could still do my job, but the damage was already done. My reputation was in ruins. Every time I tried to regain trust, something else would happen. Another mistake, another missed opportunity. It felt like everyone was waiting for me to fail. I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was behind it, somehow still pulling the strings. The bills started piling up. I was paying for the lawyer, trying to keep up with my rent, my car, everything. But with the demotion at work, my paycheck had taken a hit, and it wasn't enough to cover everything. I started falling behind on payments, dipping into savings that were quickly running out. I was on the brink of financial ruin, and Greg seemed to know it. Then Greg made his final move. He reached out to me, suggesting we meet to settle things once and for all. I agreed, knowing I didn't have much choice. We met at a small office, where his lawyer was waiting with a stack of papers. Greg offered me a deal. If I signed over partial control of my assets to him, he'd drop his claims on the property and help me with my debts. He framed it like he was doing me a favor, giving me a way out of the mess he had created. But the terms were all in his favor. If I signed, he would have a say in every financial decision I made. He'd have control over the property, my accounts, even my job choices. It was clear he wanted to control my life completely, just as he had done with my mother all those years ago. I looked at the papers, knowing what it would mean if I signed them, but I was out of options. The legal battle could drag on for years, and I didn't have the resources to fight that long. Greg had me backed into a corner, and he knew it. He sat there, calm and confident, watching me with a smug smile, waiting for me to give in. I picked up the pen, knowing that by signing, I was giving him exactly what he wanted. There was no other choice. I signed the papers, handing over control, feeling the weight of it settle over me like a dark cloud. Greg's smile widened, and he reached across the table, patting me on the shoulder like a victor. As I left the office, I realized this had been his plan all along. From the moment he sent that first message, he had been working to take control, to dominate my life just as he had done before. There was no happy ending here, no last-minute escape. Greg had won, and I was left with nothing but the ruins of what had once been my life. I walked out into the cold, knowing that Greg now held all the cards, and there was nothing more I could do.